My name is Nancy Rhymes Nelson. About 15 years ago, a good friend of my husband Jay and I, Jack Pugsley, many of you know him, another great mind that is missed. He was very close friends with us, and he says, "You've got to meet this couple. They live near me, and you would really love them." And that couple was Rick and Bonnie Rule. And even though Jack or Jay nor Jay are with us today, I'm happy to say that the Rules and I have remained good friends. Now, everybody knows Rick is the president, director, chief executive officer of Sprott U.S. Holdings. He leads a team of professionals, earth scientists, if you will, financial executives that are well known throughout the world in resource investment management. But what a lot of people don't know is how Rick is passionate about spreading the word of freedom and liberty throughout the world. And he's also a very good mentor. I have seen him mentor many people. I know them. In fact, I'll share a personal story. I joined, after Jay died, I was starved for intellectual stimulation, so I joined a Mises group in Orange County. And I met all sorts of young people that are right on board with liberty and freedom, anarchy, whatever. They found out, I don't know how, I must have mentioned it, but that I knew Rick and Bonnie Rule. And they said, "You know Rick Rule?" And I said, "Yes." I said, "As a matter of fact, I'm supposed to go to their house, next week for dinner." And they were just awestruck. "And is there any way you can introduce us to him?" So I emailed Bonnie and I said, "Would you mind if I brought two young men with me?" And she very graciously said, "Not at all, bring them down." So I went to their house and they sat with Rick for several hours, and Rick was mentoring them. And I've seen that same story repeated over and over again. Now, there used to be an old commercial for the financial industry, but I'm going to sort of paraphrase it in that when Rick Rule talks, people listen. So let's listen and welcome Rick Rule.
Nancy, thank you for that kind introduction. I think about the various things I've said over the last 30 years, and the fact that people do listen occasionally has given me the opportunity to cause incalculable harm, and I'm sorry about that. I'd like to begin the way we all should at a conference like this. Many of you know I'm coming off my own conference, and conference organization, running a conference is really, really, really tough. I mean, talk about herding cats, trying to get Doug Casey to show up, all this. I mean, Jesus, what a challenge. So as a consequence of that, I'd like everybody to give a big round of applause to Jayant and Rajni. You'll notice the skilled public speaker makes sure that he or she gets one really good applause line, and I just did that to you. The camera will record me standing here with you all standing and clapping, and it will reflect very well on me. This conference has been marked. Before I do that, just a brief announcement. I'd like to also thank those of you who came to my conference last week, the conference before this. It was really nice to have you all there. It was also nice to have the continuum from that conference to this conference. This really isn't about that. This conference, like all of Jayant and Rajni's conferences, has been really marked by a very high intellectual tone. Great speakers, great ideas, more philosophical, more esoteric, and that's over. This is going to be base, crass, commercial, as befits the speaker. And I don't want you to think about, and I'm not going to really give a speech. I did a lot of those last week. I'm going to have a discussion. I don't want you to think about this in philosophical terms or moral terms, well, maybe moral terms a little bit. I want you to think about this as a stakeholder. I normally hate the term stakeholder, but I understand in the context of corporatism, stakeholders. I want you to think about this as a shareholder in a business, or an owner of a business, or as an employee of a business, or as a customer of a business. In other words, I want this to be about you. You in any of those roles, or all of those roles, because we all occupy various roles. Walter's the professor, I'm the hustler, okay? And so think about the delivery in the context of the difference between a professor and a hustler. Giant said that one of the things that he wanted to do this year was create some controversy. That was the nature of the first speaker, and that was obviously the nature of Walter's talk. And Doug, when he breathes, is controversial. I thought about what I was doing today, and in this audience, it's actually not too controversial, because what I'm actually asking people to do is conduct their lives, their commercial lives, their corporate lives, in the context of the non-aggression principle. But it's a theme that's extremely controversial in society. Across the private commercial world, one of the mantras is corporate social obligation or corporate social responsibility. I've been active in the mining business now for at least 10 years, engaging in discussions about corporate responsibility and corporate social obligations, CSOs. And I want to talk about them, and I want to talk about how harmful the term is. And I want to talk about the idea that rather thinking in terms of corporate social obligation, which I think demeans the company and is an indirect tax, and I think demeans the recipient. I think one of Doug's great criticisms of philanthropy and charity is that too often it breeds not only a sense of entitlement, but also a sense in the recipient that he or she has a need that they can't meet themselves. And I want to talk in terms of corporate social obligation as a sin, in the sense that sometimes the intended recipient comes to lose their own self-respect and self-esteem. And in that sense, it isn't merely benign stupidity, but in fact an evil. I want to talk about a different concept, because I think some of the precepts of CSR or CSO are wholly positive. But I want you to think about my context, my conversation with you, in the context of the difference between two phrases: corporate social obligation and corporate social opportunity. Because I think the same circumstance, if looked at from two different points of view and employed differently, achieves much better outcomes. I also want to correct some flaws in some earlier talks of mine here at Capitalism and Morality. I do a lot of, as you know, commercial public speaking, and I don't do too much non-commercial public speaking. The consequence of that, as Walter pointed out well, is if you do something often enough, you get good at it, and if you don't do something often, you make some fairly fundamental mistakes. And I've looked at the conversations that have followed my earlier Capitalism and Morality talks on YouTube. And one of the criticisms of those talks has been very accurate, which is that I have conflated wealth with value. And so I tried to do this yesterday. I want to get this out. Wealth, to me, is the essence of well-being. It could be financial, it could be something else. My only problem dealing with the something else is I don't know much about it. So in terms of giving a talk that has something to do with value, mostly the type of wealth that I talk about is pecuniary. In this discussion, most of the value I'm going to talk about is also material wealth. But I think you'll find in the discussion that other aspects of wealth come into the discussion as well. So in the beginning, the introduction, I'm going to improperly define some phrases, but they're going to serve as my definitions for the balance of the talk, and Walter can pull them apart later on the lawn at lunch. I'm going to define money merely as a medium of exchange, what I don't think he has a problem with. I'm going to define profits as the excess of utility delivered over cost. That is, the money left over after you delivered a service. Somebody tells you what they think it's worth, they pay you for it, less whatever it costs you to produce it. And I'm going to define profit in many ways, and in fact, material wealth, as excess utility. I'm going to suggest to you that somebody who has become rich or very rich or filthy rich or whatever the category past that is, provided that they didn't engage in too much rent seeking beyond that which is justified by way of self-defense against the reality of the state, is simply the delivery of more utility than one spent. If one has received in profits greater utility than one has spent, either through consuming the utility generated by others or the cost in delivering that utility, I'm going to argue today that excess profits are the consequence of excess contribution. Ergo, the extremely successful corporation is a corporation that has delivered much more good than another corporation has, and they've done it much more efficiently. I'm also going to argue that any circumstance that reduces that efficiency is by nature bad for society. Never mind the moral argument that it violates the non-aggression principle. It's also very inefficient. Let's assume that all of us here would like to eat tomorrow and the week after. Let's assume that everybody here, when they walk into this room and they hit the light switch, would really like the lights to come on. Let's assume that when we leave here and go home, we'd like the plane to leave on time and arrive on time and arrive safely. Let's assume that we'd like to drive. The consequence of that is that we would like our food produced efficiently, cheaply, and well. We'd like people who produce our energy for it to do it efficiently at low cost. You get the point of this. The truth is that the better these voluntary collectives, called corporations or businesses, function, the better our lives are. And I think everybody, or almost everybody in this room would agree with me. And by the way, I'm not defending rent seeking. I'm not defending corporate fascism. That's a very, very different argument, one that I am not going to make. I'm going to suggest to you that anything that reduces the competitive effectiveness, the efficiency of these companies, far from being neutral, is in fact very bad for society. In the industries that I'm in, the extractive industries, the policies that we, as an involuntary group, as a government, are pursuing, are going to increase profoundly our costs of living 10 years, 15 years, and 20 years from today. This doesn't have so much to do with corporate social obligation as it does with politically, non-empirically originated regulation and science that's based on a narrative as opposed to evidence. That could be next year's lecture. But this year's lecture is going to focus on the difference between corporate social obligation and corporate social opportunity. Because the truth is that there are many ways that a corporation or a business becomes more efficient. But the narrative in the world now is that the generators of wealth and the possessors of wealth owe a second duty to society. My suggestion to you is that the fact that they've earned great profits is evidence that they have already discharged their duty to society in its entirety. My argument is, secondly, that the very, very, very highly paid employees of that organization have demonstrated their utility to consumers or else, believe me, at Sprott, we would fire them. The truth is, in my business, I've noticed that the employees I'm the fondest of at the end of the year are the ones who earned the $1 million bonuses. And the people that I'm less fond of are the people who are the $50,000 a year employees who we couldn't find a way to bonus because we couldn't find any surplus utility generated. And I'm not speaking about the whole of the public, but so much of the public, and of course the elected leaders that, as we learned earlier, follow the public, have decided that the $1 million producer is somehow a villain and the successful corporation is somehow the oppressor, when in truth, the opposite is true. But the discussion remains in society, and even in industries as intellectually primitive is the mining and the oil and gas industry, that somehow the rich, somehow the productive owe more. What corporate social obligation is, in its essence, is a tax. It's a sense that there are ills that a certain part of society has addressed that need to be rectified, but because the people who have identified the ills either don't have the means or don't have the will to address those ills with their own capital, they've decided to address them with mine. I obviously take exception to that. And I'm using me to be an icon for all of you that are employees or owners of this business. And I think that's very wrong. There is a suggestion in the mining industry, as an example. I'm going to talk a lot about mining in just a little while. A, because it's a good case study, and B, because unusually it's a topic that I can talk about from a knowledge base as opposed to just talking. There's a suggestion in the mining business that we owe an environmental remediation duty, not just for current operations, but for past operations, and we'll talk about that. There's a sense in extractive industries in Canada that Aboriginal people, First Nations in BC, across Canada, are owed a historic debt. And there's a sense that the extractive industries have an affirmative duty to correct past wrongs and, in fact, prevent future wrongs. There's a sense that the corporate world, the private world, the business world must make additional and forced contribution to education. There is a sense that those of us who have been successful need in some way, shape, or form privately to address the provision of social services and public services, in addition to what has been addressed rightly or wrongly through the extortion of tax from us. There's a sense that we have a duty over and above the duty that we are already required to discharge through taxes. And I'm going to suggest that that is not merely wrong from a moral point of view, but much more wrong from a factual, applied, practical point of view. Nobody in this room, I think, is going to suggest that the forced redistribution of wealth, the extortion or fraud that we commonly associate with taxation, is right from a moral point of view. We may or may not argue about it from a practical point of view. But I want to establish with you, first of all, that what corporate social obligation or corporate social responsibility is a tax. It's a new form of tax, and as a consequence of that, is morally wrong. But I want to talk about corporate social opportunity, because corporate social opportunity can achieve some of the same goals, albeit from the point of view of a utility maximizing organization. And in that sense, it is both right and it is also more efficient. Let's talk about some of the functions that society has decided are corporate social obligations. And let's think about them as corporate social opportunities. Let's talk about affirmative action. The idea that a company has the obligation to address past injustices with regards to previously disadvantaged groups. Or, Walter, how do I say all that politically correct shit? Is that the right phrase? Like previously disadvantaged or historically disadvantaged or something like that? Walter did a very good job, I think, talking in a theoretical sense about why that's mostly, on an ongoing basis, nonsense. I would argue with Walter, however, that there are incorrect prejudices that operate in the world today, and that often in the private sector and almost always in the public sector, that those prejudices persist and that they are both wrong and inefficient. One of the things that we notice in the corporate world, and at Sprott maybe you could even say in the big corporate world, is that there is an extraordinary competition for top-end talent. And one of the things that an entrepreneur is taught to do is find market inefficiencies. Whether or not it ought to happen in economic theory, there are certain groups in society that we expect less of. And as a consequence of that, they expect less of themselves. And it turns out that they're cheaper. Not too long ago, I had occasion to go pitch the Stanford University Endowment, which is one of the most prestigious investors in the world. At the risk of saying this on the film, if you nail the Stanford University Endowment, you can nail almost anybody on the planet, just simply because you nailed the Stanford University Endowment. When I used to make these pitches 20 years ago, 25 years ago, everybody that I was pitching, every analyst from the institution that I was talking to looked like me. I was talking to a mirror. If there were 4 people there, there were 4 white males. That's what it was. One of the deals I made when I went to pitch the Stanford University Endowment, I won't tell you how I got to make the deal. I won't do that on film. I said, I want to go, I want to pitch, but I want to pitch your best analysts. I don't want to pitch a junior team and have them say yes, and then have to go pitch somebody who gets to make the decision. I want to win or lose with the best that you got. So I go in and pitch, and you know what I'm facing? 4 people, none male, none white, all South Asian females. Now, 20 years ago, it would have been all white males like me. What's important about this? You can measure investments. You can measure investment performance empirically. These 4 women had the best track record in the Stanford University Endowment in the last 10 years. That's how you could measure. I would argue that 20 years ago, the market was inferior because we expected less of Asian women. Maybe we expected less of them because, to go to Jayant's point, they were from the West, we were from the West, and they hadn't become culturally assimilated to performance yet. I don't know what the answer is. All I know is that the 4 top analysts at Stanford, measured by performance, were Asian female. A market imbalance. What does that tell you? Figure out why they did a better job. If they get paid less, hire them. But in terms of affirmative action, it tells you something else. We talked about the wage gap between men and women. If you are an organization that is competing for top talent, and believe me, there is a vicious competition for top talent. If you decide that women are earning 30% less than men because of, as an example, the tipping point argument, women come out of the workforce before they get their 10,000 hours. If they get paid less because there's an expectation that they're going to take 10 years out of the workforce, maybe what you do is what virtually all of us are doing. You identify very bright women, young, of childbearing age, and you say to them, if you choose to have a child, we would like to have a discussion with you where you work for us part-time from the home, in return for which you consider when you would like to return to the workforce full-time,
for the people who remembered you when you needed them. This isn't corporate social obligation. This isn't anything that we're doing to atone for 2,000 years of discrimination against people of childbearing age. This is because we have an investment in a young woman who is a superior woman. And if we flush her, the investment went to investment heaven. And when she comes back into the workforce, she might go to work for a competitor. Kick our ass. That's the difference between, I think, corporate social obligation and corporate social opportunity. Let's talk about education. Do I want to go there? Yeah, let's do that. Let's talk about education. There's a suggestion that corporate America, or private businesses worldwide need to do more for education. We need to do this for a whole bunch of social reasons. Wrong. Wrong. We need to do this because when we get these kids out of business school or engineering school or geology school, I mean, while those schools are wonderful proof of durability and tenacity, it takes us 5 or 6 years to get some kid who came out of geology school and make him or her into a geologist. You get some kid out of business school, and it takes us 5 or 6 years to knock all the horseshit out of them and turn them into businessmen. And we need to be more efficient about this. The private sector needs to participate in education out of self-defense, not out of obligation. But we need to do it for another reason, too. If you go on the Sprott website, if you go on the Sprott Global website in particular, there's about 200 hours of educational programming on that website. Basically, all of the information that we apply on your behalf is available for free on our website. Almost every technique that we use on a day-to-day basis, not the newly discovered ones, but the ones we've learned in the last 40 years of working, they're all on the website. We give them all to you. How could that possibly be in our interest? I mean, it's like if Coca-Cola emailed you the secret formula for Coca-Cola. Sprott has the secret formula, the secret sauce. It's there. 200 hours. Why? 4 reasons. More educated customers, more educated consumers are more successful. If you're in the financial services business, a successful client gets richer. Who do you think is better for us, a big client or a small client? Simple. Simple. Second, this is important too, branding. When we talk to groups like this, if you were all potential customers, we would talk about the educational material on our website. We would talk about the Mining Investment College, a 50-hour course that we did with the Colorado School of Mines. The Colorado School of Mines sold for $1,000, and we give away for nothing. We talk about ore deposits, all the stuff on our website. And we say, you know, this is all there, and what we'd really like to know is how you think our educational materials compete with the educational materials offered up by Bank of Montreal, Merrill Lynch, or E-Trade. Oh, they don't have any of those? Well, maybe you ought to consider the two organizations in terms of the benefit that they offer you and whether or not they care about you. Are we offering up this education to people to correct some social ill? Of course not. We're offering up this education out of self-defense and to kick the hell out of our competitors. What's better? Obligation or opportunity? Let's keep talking about this. Social services, and there could be a whole range of social services. One social service is the fact that, as an example, transportation or housing can be very inefficient. We can talk about why it's inefficient. But to the extent that an employer can offer assistance to its employees, either in terms of subsidizing, this example, their use of publicly available transit, or varying their operating hours so that the employees come to work at 7 o'clock in the morning as opposed to rush hour. Are we doing this to solve a traffic problem? Of course not. We're doing it to compete for workers. The discussion that's taking place in northern BC now between the corporate community and indigenous communities, I would call it a respect discussion. Should we be engaging in the respect discussion because of historic inequities? No. We should do it because we want to be part of those communities and because we learn by offering up respect. I would suggest to you, when you are viewing the discussion that I'm trying to have with you in the context of you being owners of the business or shareholders of the business or employees of the business, that you consider that it's in your long-term and short-term self-interest to engage in all of these discussions, in all of these facets, because it's in your economic interest to do so. It's in your economic interest for a few reasons. The first is, it's efficient. By doing these things when other people don't do them, or specifically when your competitors don't do them, you win, they lose. You do it because it's an essential part, or can be if you do it, an essential part of your brand. In other words, in the first instance, you do it because you're competing for workers or something like that. In the second instance, you do it because of your brand. I notice now, as an example, that there's an awful lot of restoration of wetlands going on in East Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. And a lot of this private restoration of wetlands is being done, ironically, by the oil and gas industry. It's very tough for the environmental community to challenge the Exxon Bayou, where Exxon spends $40 million in conjunction with Ducks Unlimited to restore 50,000 acres of wetlands in southwest Louisiana destroyed by Katrina. There's a whole bunch of reasons to do this. But one of the reasons to do it is to build a public brand that refutes the arguments which are held up against Exxon. The other reason to do it, and the reason why we should do all of these things, is it turns out to be an awfully effective morale builder in the company that's involved in doing these things. One of the things that I started noticing about the young people in my part of Sprott is that to the extent that we participate with groups like Liberty.me, Students for Liberty, the young people that are part of our organization feel like they're part of something bigger. It gives them a way to identify with the company that they work with and work for that's bigger, that's easier to identify with than simply the place that they come, educate clients, generate commissions, or do whatever they do. The opportunity part of corporate social turns out to be a tremendous morale builder and a tremendous team builder. It builds the brand not just without, among the constituencies, but also within, among the participants. I'd like to tell a couple of stories that I think evidence this. Some of you, certainly Bonnie, my wife, will have heard of a guy named Bob Quartermain. Bob Quartermain is a very unlikely social crusader. He comes from a small town in New Brunswick. He was, in military flight school in high school, that kind of stuff. He went straight from there to being a geologist. From there, he spent, the first 10 years of his life getting bit by mosquitoes in remote mining camps. He's not one that you would normally think of as a social crusader, but he's a social crusader. He spent his life exploring for mines in strange places. The first time he had the bad fortune to find one in Argentina, he went to put it in production, the Perquitas mine. And Bob figured out, among other things, that women, I'm going to go right to what Walter does now, I'm going to generalize based on observation, happens to be true. Women are better implementers. They follow instruction better. And Bob was going to have to teach a whole bunch of people in the Andes who were not quite Stone Age people, but awful close, how to operate heavy equipment. And what he found out was that women, for whatever reason, did it right, and men did it wrong. Specifically with regards to these great, big, huge dump trucks, 200-ton trucks. These things have 8 tires, and each tire is $18,000. And if you operate these trucks at about 9 miles an hour, and you stay a meter away from the side of the road, you don't blow tires. Well, the women didn't blow tires and the men blew tires. And so Bob figured out that he had to implement affirmative action. He could only hire women to drive trucks. Now this is an odd form of social crusade. Ironically, Bob was criticized by NGOs for disrupting the normal employment arrangements in the region. I'm not making this shit up. There was this suggestion from the NGOs that these women should be hoeing potatoes or sewing baskets or something like that, making $2 a day, as opposed to making $45 a day operating trucks. In fact, fortunately, that's a discussion that we want. Fast forward to today, Bob has discovered a wonderful gold deposit in northeastern BC, the Brucejack deposit. And the Brucejack deposit is on the, it is on land that is claimed as ancestral territory of 3 different First Nations. The truth is that the deposit is above timberline, there's nothing to eat, and there's no Indian's right mind that ever went there before there was gold discovered. But that notwithstanding, it's in the claimed ancestral territory of 3 bands. The Nishka, the Tahltan, and the Shkukumraksha, I think is how I'm supposed to say it. I try and be respectful. That's what they want to be called. Why not compliment? Why would we piss people off if we would make friends? So Shkukumraksha. It happens that the ancestral chief of the Tahltan, Jerry Asp, is a close friend of mine, a business partner, and has been for many, many years. And I want to share with you some of what Quartermain did, not out of a sense of obligation, but in terms of common sense. The first thing he did is, when he went to address the Tahltan, because he knows Jerry too, he learned enough Tahltan that he could at least make the greeting in Tahltan. Now, no white guy since the beginning of time did that. And he owned it. Okay? He owned it. He didn't have to say almost anything else. He just went, said, "Thank you, I'm your guest," and he said it in Tahltan. Obligation? Of course not. Showed respect. He employed them. This is their place. And I was asking Bob about this. How's this working? And he says, well, it has to work for a whole bunch of reasons. We need social license. We can't bring in a bunch of outsiders to work there to obtain social license. He says, but more importantly, I'm hiring people who would otherwise fly up from Vancouver. So I got to fly them in. They work for 3 weeks. I got to fly them out. Their families are down here. They wish they were here. The jobs are up there. Meanwhile, in rural communities, there's no jobs. And all those people, the First Nations people, are moving up there to come down here. I mean, doesn't it make more sense that you give the jobs to people who live up there and want to be there, than people who live down here and don't want to be up there? He says the problem has been a lack of capacity, a lack of training. So he started these young First Nations people out, first of all doing surface surveys, line cutting, doing things like making core boxes, that's basically nailing boards together. But over the 3 years that he's been in place, he has added the skill sets that society neglected to provide these people with, to the extent now that 30% of his workforce is First Nations. And he tells me in terms of efficiency, there's no difference in efficiency, but in terms of satisfaction, that the local workers express much more satisfaction than the fly-in workers. Not surprisingly, because they're at home. Now, obligation or opportunity? The human part of the story, and this will choke me up. So, I guess about 2 years ago, Bob flies up for more consultation with Jerry Asp. And Jerry says, we've got some cultures that we like you, we'd like to introduce you to. And so, they actually did a blending of cultures. But they have a sweat lodge ceremony where the people go in the sweat lodge and they get all smoky and sweaty and stuff. They did, in a great cross-cultural meeting, drink a little beer before they did this. So they had a couple of beers, they went to the sweat lodge, all this kind of stuff. And then afterwards they went fishing. And it's wonderful in terms of the human connection. I was talking to Quartermain after, he says, God, thank God I caught a couple of fish. I didn't want to be up and, be the white guy who, couldn't do anything, just the guy who pushed numbers around and signed paychecks. And I talked to Jerry, afterwards. Jerry asked my friend who was the former ancestral chief about how things work. He said, thank God Bob caught a couple of fish. You know, the great thing about this is all of a sudden wasn't a First Nations guy and a white guy. It was two guys who had respect for each other, who needed each other, and who were both delighted to show each other a good time. Now, what part of obligation is that? No part of obligation. Who's going to make the money? It's the opportunity. The Tahltan First Nation, by the way, I don't know if you know the Tahltans. The Tahltans live in the middle of nowhere. I mean, truly in the middle of nowhere. Jerry resigned as chief, he wouldn't even be the electoral chief, to run the head of the Tahltan Economic Development Agency. The Tahltans have their own private sector initiative. There was no power there. And so they built a high-head power station at Dease Lake, and they actually powered the reserve rather than with diesel, with in-place hydro. They did it. We didn't do it. Unemployment in the Tahltan ancestral territory, Jerry, I don't know what the real number is. Jerry says there's 3 of our band that are unemployed, and that's because they're unemployable. Not unlike what might happen in our culture. A couple of years ago, it looked like there may be an NDP government here in BC. And don't get me wrong, I'm no friend of the Liberals or the Socreds, but the NDP government had a profoundly anti-mining agenda. I called up Jerry and I said, so what do you think happens in Northwest BC if we get an NDP government? And he says, Rick, this riding is 80% First Nations, okay? We're from here. And we understand if it isn't for mining, we're going to go back to trapping muskrats 3 months a year, and that's it. The shadow minister for the NDP for mining is in this region, and we've already told him if he thinks he's sending us back on the trap line, he's got another thing coming. He says, so all you white capitalists, you understand, it's going to be the First Nations that save you. That is, I think, the outgrowth. The fact that a community that you embrace, if you were doing extractive industry or any other, is the industry that saves you. We talked earlier today about the fact that politicians are followers, not leaders. And it's the thought in the community that drives the politics, not the other way around. That's part of what corporate social opportunity is about. How much time do I have left?
15 minutes.
15 minutes. Yeah, I'm going to skip the rest of it because I want to entertain some questions. The only thing I do want to say about this is when I thought about this, when I was beginning to write the speech, I also began to think about this in the context not necessarily of corporate groups or business groups, personal. One of the things that has brought me an awful lot of personal pleasure over the last 5 years is what I might call personal social opportunity. I've had the good fortune to do 2 different things. Because I speak reasonably well, and because I've been reasonably successful in terms of investments, I've cultivated a very broad audience. And I learned from Doug Casey, if you have credibility in one area, you can spend it in another area. And I have been able, in the consequence of my own life, to give lectures about investing where I throw in all kinds of libertarian stuff. If I appeared in front of the audiences on YouTube or the other places I appeared, and I said, you know, I want to discuss the labor theory of value or some shit like that, you know, this interview would get like 6 watches on YouTube. When you talk about 15 things that you need to know about mining investment, and number 11 is government's evil, you could lay a whole bunch of cool messages in. And what I've found is that this, what I would call personal social opportunity, is in many ways, it's easier to affect. As an example, when I try and involve a company, even our own size, Sprott is 175 employees, it can be an 8 or 9 month fight to get us to do the right thing. I can have a discussion with myself in 8 or 9 minutes, and assuming I've identified the right thing, I can do the right thing right away. And I think every argument that applies to corporate social opportunity as opposed to corporate social obligation applies to all of us in our own life. We all have the ability, not so much to cause others to do the right thing, and not so much, to do the right thing ourselves, and not out of any sense of obligation, I think we all need to view it as an opportunity to build our brand, to lower our costs, to increase the respect and stature that we enjoy in society. So that's really all I want to say. I could have probably been more controversial. This is a controversial talk, I think, outside this room, and I believe it's a testimony in the room that isn't particularly controversial inside. So, any questions or comments about that? Nobody argues.
Questions? I will try. I made it. When I was in law school, taking a jurisprudence class from Carl Llewellyn, and he was enunciating some normative principle. I can't remember what it was. And one of the students told him, he said, that sounds very good in theory, but it doesn't work in practice. To which Carl responded, if it doesn't work in practice, it's not good theory. I'm kind of reminded of when a lot of the questions that come up in terms of these ideas of social responsibility of business. I'm reminded of an article someone wrote many years ago to which I responded that one of these social responsibilities that people had, and they're particularly directed toward the business community, involves sexual gratification. And right away I was wondering who they might have in mind in terms of bearing the cost. And I was wondering, since what is happening in most of these areas, what you're talking about is, let's take some of the profits from activities for which we haven't borne the cost and just take them for our particular benefit. And I was wondering if if some beautiful, well-built woman had a social obligation to have sex with some guy who couldn't get satisfying gratification in any other way.
When I was young and single, I would have argued yes.
But it reminded me of one of my classes about 2 or 3 years ago, where I was trying to take my third-year law students to focus their attention on the kinds of questions that, if you found yourself on an otherwise deserted island with a bunch of other people, what kind of conditions would you like to have present in order to have a viable community? And I was kind of looking or expecting that maybe they'd be talking about respect for property, respect for contractual undertakings, nonviolence, and so forth. Instead, they all start talking about free food, free clothing, free housing, and this really startled me. I thought by the third year in law school, they'd figured something out. So I just asked the question, who's going to provide for that? Who's going to pay the cost? Not a single response.
The wonderful thing for me about socialism and government both is I'm talking about for me personally, is it removes a lot of very smart, very capable people from competing with me. They go into these idiotic dead ends, and it's easier to outcompete, given that many people who would otherwise do the right thing go into government or some other sort of line for us. I get it. The young people who were diverted to free food, while it would be useful if they became customers of mine or employees, of course, I'm delighted they're not competitors. Jan?
Yeah, I was just wondering, with your guys' mining operations in BC and stuff, I was thinking that employing First Nations and stuff like this, it really probably brings more people towards, the theories of liberty and capitalism, and these people might get some away from the socialist sort of establishment that way, because you're basically providing them with an opportunity to engage in capitalism.
I think you heard the questioner's statement. I'm not a sociologist or economist or anything. I'm a credit analyst, which is a fancy way of saying a loan shark. The narrative evidence I have talking to guys like Jerry Asp and Chief Joe from Onion Lake is that native cultures viewed in the distant past I mean, when I say distant past, 150 years ago, were reasonably libertarian, and that the collectivist aspects, or the forced collectivist aspects of those societies has been something that we have introduced to them. The method of self-defense, if you felt yourself to be part of a family group that was being persecuted by other family groups in the band, was to leave. There were great senses of private property in Western Canada. As an example, individual people within a tribe would have as a right a certain section of the stream which had 3 or 4 beaver colonies. If they killed all the beaver, they would have obliterated their property over time. They solved the commons problem through private property. So if you talk to some First Nations groups, and I'm not pretending that I'm a cultural anthropologist, but if you talk to some First Nations leaders in the context of how they operated traditionally, and you talk about the voluntarism, the mutual dependence, but voluntary dependence within those bands, there's not very much to object to from my point of view. So I suspect a lot of the attitudes that are so harmful to native cultures in North America today have been introduced like measles and syphilis by us. Other questions?
Yeah.
Yes, hi Rick. I think we can agree it's smart and self-interested and coordinated to establish respectful relationships for the benefit of his project. We can agree that it makes perfect economic sense for him to train up locals so he can hire them instead of doing a fly-in, fly-out project. Where the difficulty is when you keep going down this path, the next step is he signs an agreement for preferred contracting with the local companies, which is setting himself up to be subject to a cartel. And then the next step is he guarantees a % of profits in exchange for support and cooperation during the environmental assessment process. At what stage do you become from self-interested to basically submitting to rent seeking?
So that's entirely pragmatic. If you're doing business in extractive industries around the world, how do I put this? There are payments to facilitate. It's interesting that if that happens in the Congo, it's a bribe. If it happens in California, it's a campaign contribution. So I understand the dilemma that you propose, and I'm not sympathetic, I'm empathetic, I face it every day. We try and deal with that, some of us try and deal with it in the extractive industries by, through organizations like the Prospectors and Developers of Canada, Independent Producers Association of Canada, the Association of Mineral Exploration for BC, by finding promising young First Nations people, Aboriginals I guess is a shorter way of saying that, and arranging for them to have access to technical education at places like the Colorado School of Mines and the University of British Columbia. What I have found to myself is that when I deal in Aboriginal communities like the Wind River Reserve in central Wyoming, when I'm dealing in those communities now, I'm dealing with native engineers, native geologists, native lawyers, native landmen, and they turn out to be spectacular partners. The regulation that I'm subjected to is local regulation with local knowledge. In the state of, well, in any American state, the regulatory jurisdiction is federal, state, and local. And any jurisdiction, any group of that can apply for lead agency status. If you have the opportunity in central Wyoming to have the Aboriginal groups, because of their expertise, take lead agency status, what it means is the Aboriginal communities themselves defend you from having rules applied to you that made sense in Florida, but have absolutely no application to central Wyoming. We had a case 4 years ago, I guess, drilling a couple of wells in central Wyoming, and the regulations that we were subjected to went like this. We don't want you cutting roads across those side hills because they're bentonite, they're expansive soils, and the road will slide out. No problem for us, it's local knowledge. You need to run surface casing down to 250 meters because you're going to hit a helium horizon and your well's going to blow out. No problem with that. They probably saved us $1 million a well. We would prefer that you didn't drill wells in this valley at this time of year because it's elk calving season. You know what I'm saying? I'm with it. You know, I'm absolutely all for it. If I have a chance in BC, in northwestern BC, to be governed by the Nishka, the Shkukumlaksha, and the Tolten, people who need me that I need, would I prefer all relationships to be contractual, voluntary? Of course. Do I live in that world, and am I going to live in that world in my lifetime? I don't think so. So if I had a choice between being regulated by local affected people as opposed to by the Commonwealth, I'd take that 10 days out of 10.
Hi Rick, so you mentioned that you had more to say, and so I was wondering if you could just give us the cliff notes of what else you have prepared.
I was going to give you two other examples. One being Agora Inc., which has 2.2 million unique subscribers, and is involved in investor and political consumer education, but of course, one of the things that they found is in terms of their advertising, advertorial works, they give away information in hopes of selling the ability to analyze the information, paradigm. And that process leads them to be able to sell for a very high price, branded conclusion. But the front-end products, which are free, if you look at them, the Sovereign Individual, Bill Bonner's Diary, what they have found is that there's a huge market for libertarian ideas, but you can't advertise them as libertarian ideas because people aren't interested in buying some sort of general good. People are interested in buying a specific good. But if you're Agora, you send out 3 million pieces of email a day. I'm not kidding, 3 million pieces of email a day that are explicitly libertarian. The laissez-faire letter goes out to 300,000 people, and you can tell by the name what it is. Are they doing this to spread the message of liberty? Well, knowing Bill Bonner, yes, partly. But the truth is that they have found that the type of investor who likes to read their investment publication identifies with the very values that we espouse. So they're building a brand for themselves. Writing these things is enormously fun for the young analysts. So they're building morale within the organization. They certainly, I know Bill very well, they're certainly not doing this out of any sense of obligation. And if you think it's true for Bill, I don't know if any of you know Porter Stansbury. Porter Stansbury, self-interest is what it's all about. And he's sending out hugely libertarian pieces. Yes, partly because it amuses him, but partially because it helps identify and segregate the audience that he's interested in reaching. So that was going to be another example. Yes, Walter. Sorry?
What's the other example?
Us, Sprott. We do the same thing.
I really enjoyed your talk. I learned a lot from it. I especially appreciated this defense of crony capitalism. It shows you have both feet on the ground, and that's the reality. If you don't do that, you can't be in business. And it's a very sophisticated point. I have one suggestion, and that is that I hate with a purple passion the expression rent-seeking. I think rent-seeking is a very good concept, what it implies.
If you were an apartment building.
Well, there are two senses of rent. One, you rent a car, you rent an apartment, which is a perfectly good thing. And the other is a thing called economic rent. So if you make $1 million a year, but your next best opportunity is only $100,000 a year, you're really making $900,000 rent. So it's a perfectly good concept. So why do these public choice people use that word to put something...
Guilty as charged, and I'll tell you why. You see, I followed this economist, Walter Block, who was speaking, and so I wanted to use an economic term as opposed to coercion or bribe or corruption. So it's entirely my fault. You know, I should never speak after an economist. It really screws up my choice of words.
Well, I would suggest booty seeking or theft seeking or anything but rent seeking. I mean, it's sort of like using a nice word, rent, to depict something horrible, evil, and only the public choice people who don't distinguish between aggression and non-aggression, they're the ones who fomented it. I'm on this warpath to stop the use of that word in that way. But thanks for having me.
You're welcome.
Rick, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jay.